Good evening. On behalf of the University of Notre Dame, its faculty, staff, and students, and the co-sponsors of tonight's event, I'd like to welcome you to the 5th annual Shakespeare Lecture in honor of Professor Stanley Wells. My name is Warren von Eschenbach, and I am the Assistant Provost and Academic Director of the University of Notre Dame in England. And we're very delighted to have, as tonight's speaker, Professor Potter to deliver tonight's address, and look forward to her remarks. Just briefly, for those visiting for the first time, I'd like to extend a special welcome to you and also to our students who are here this evening to the University of Notre Dame London Global Gateway, which is the university's largest among its international academic centers. So welcome to you for those who are visiting for the first time. Before I ask Boyka to come introduce our speaker, I'd like to just say a few words of thanks to our co-sponsors. Unfortunately, representatives could not be here tonight, but I'd like to thank them anyway. Michael Dobson from the Shakespeare Institute and Paul Edmondson from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, and of course to Professor Wells for being here tonight, making this evening so special. Every year it's one of our highlights of the many events that we do in the London Global Gateway, and we always look forward to it, so thank him for his support. I'd also like to acknowledge some of our colleagues and honored guests who are here, University trustee Bob Conway and his wife, Ricky. And I'd also like to give a warm welcome to our Associate Dean of College of Arts and Letters, Professor Peter Holland, for being with us tonight. So thank you all for being here. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Boyka, who really is one of the driving forces behind this speaker series and really helps. We could not organize this event without her. And so I just want to extend my gratitude to her and ask her to come introduce tonight's speaker. So thank you.
Welcome, everyone. The last couple of years have been rich in Shakespeare celebrations. 2014 marked the 450th anniversary of his birth. This year, we celebrate the quadricentenary of his death. Our Shakespeare lecture in honor of Stanley Wells is in its 5th edition. Without presuming that it will reach a biblical longevity, I believe it has become an important sign in the presence of Notre Dame in the intellectual life of London. Today's event is also our contribution to the wider Shakespeare celebrations. On alternative years, we have invited as speakers distinguished academics and theatre practitioners. Professor Stanley Wells' opening lecture was followed by Nicholas Heitner's, Professor Anne Thompson's, by Dominic Dromgoole's. This year, we are privileged to have as with us a woman of extraordinary scholarly charisma, Professor Emerita Lois Potter. Lois is one of these rare scholars who travel with lightness and grace on a path of unfailing excellence. After her first degree at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania, she took her PhD at Cambridge. Then she worked for nearly 30 years in Britain, after which she returned to the US to become the Ned Allen Professor of English at the University of Delaware. After retiring, she felt again the pull of London and came to live here. She continues to write about Shakespeare and other playwrights and is in the center of scholarly and theatrical life. Lois's interests are remarkably wide. Her numerous publications span the period from the medieval legend of Robin Hood and medieval drama to Milton and the Cavaliers. Of course, the center of her work are Shakespeare and his contemporaries, and she has left a mark as theatre historian, performance critic, editor, and biographer. She possesses, in the words of a colleague, an unparalleled theatrical awareness. of which her book on Othello for the Shakespeare in Performance series is a brilliant example, as is her earlier work on Twelfth Night. The numerous publications on performance and her theatre reviews combine extraordinary detail and a fine understanding of the problems which might arise and how directors and actors have resolved them. Lois's work as an editor is exemplified by her Arden edition of The Two Noble Kinsmen, which pays particular attention to the collaborative nature of the play. Her ubiquitous knowledge of the period, combined with her remarkable memory, achieves full reign in her major work to date, The Life of William Shakespeare, a book I keep on my desk and dip into before every class, so now my students know where my better ideas come from. Its virtuoso insights into the literary and historical contexts, often neglected in other studies, show who Shakespeare worked with as an author and actor, and how these collaborations may have affected his writing. The book was Stanley Wells' choice for a Shakespeare Book of the Year for the readers of the TLS in 2012. Another colleague, who is also with us, Russ MacDonald, described the life as ranking with the most distinguished examples of biographical writing about Shakespeare. In his TLS review, he beautifully sums up the impact of her work, and here I have a longer passage from Russ. Her achievement lies in her Catholicity, her simultaneous commitment to matters personal, historical, theatrical, literary, cultural. She exhibits an absolute command of the available facts, a lifetime's acquaintance with the works gained in teaching and playgoing, an unparalleled, this word again, unparalleled familiarity with theatrical history from 1567 to the present, and a talent for connecting the fictional and the actual, end of quote. As a cherished colleague, and in a true Shakespearean fashion, Lois is a much sought-for collaborator and has published along with many colleagues. A lifetime passion for her has also been to bring back to life plays that had long faded from view. Her play readings are legendary among her students, while her latest undertaking in this direction was a staged reading of Dr. Johnson's only play, Irene, which took place in his home on the Strand, and I am told was a remarkable event, not least because several of the cast and a few in the audience were people who had published books on Johnson. A captivating speaker, she delights audiences with her vast knowledge and perceptions into drama and history. And I'm delighted to welcome her to this podium.
Gosh, thanks so much, Boyk. I really enjoyed listening to that. I just wish I could hear the person you were describing. And thanks to Notre Dame for inviting me, and especially for inviting me to an event in honor of Stanley Wells. Stanley has been very kind to me since the days when I was a young academic. He encouraged me to write for Shakespeare Survey. I'm not sure if I should thank him for getting me to write one of those massive reviews where you have to read everything published on the subject in a year, but anyway, I did that. He also encouraged me to write long review essays about productions, which I did very much enjoy. And when I was going to address the Shakespeare Conference in Stratford, which is probably the scariest audience in the world, he gave me a lot of useful advice. One point I remember in particular was that microphone or no microphone, it's better to speak up. So that's what I'm doing right now, and I hope it's not blasting the system. Does this sound okay? Yeah? Okay, right. I assume that I was asked to talk to you because my one claim to fame is that I go to the theater a lot. For instance, I would certainly be in the Guinness Book of Records if there were some category for the person who has seen the most productions of The Two Noble Kinsmen. I can count 9 in the theater, including 1 in Czech, plus 3 on video, of which 1 was in Japanese. All this theater going has definitely had an effect on my reading of Shakespeare, and it is the focus of my talk, although not perhaps in the way you might expect. Anyone who goes to the theater as much as I do, or as Stanley does, and probably many of you, has had a lot of experiences that are not apparently relevant to what one might call the play itself. This is what I mean by the contingent or contingency. Some of these experiences are obvious, and they have to do with coincidence. There was a time when audiences at Macbeth would react to lines like, "The night has been unruly, where we lived our chimneys were blown down." There have been years of very high winds when that suddenly got everybody sitting up. When I saw Laurence Olivier's Othello in 1964, there was excitement that had nothing to do with his performance, which of course was exciting, because the news that day indicated that the Turk with the most mighty preparation was making for Cyprus, and that scene in the Senate, which normally nobody pays any attention to, suddenly got a lot of attention. Unexpected Shakespeare moments are quite likely to happen when one sees productions in other countries. The director has to decide whether to cut or rewrite lines that are meaningless outside of an English or American context, or even positively insulting, like some of the comments on other nationalities. When I went to see The Winter's Tale in Prague in the early 1990s, I thought the production was bound to cut the notorious line, "Thou art perfect then, our ship hath touched upon the deserts of Bohemia," since there is no such place, and everybody in Prague certainly knew that. But no, the actor actually spoke those lines in Czech, of course, but in a special tone of voice, which came out as, "Are you sure our ship has touched on the deserts of Bohemia?" It's still more exciting when the production is given under conditions of censorship and lines that were written 400 years ago are made to apply to a contemporary situation that can't be attacked directly. This is a really fascinating subject, but it's been very well covered by Boyka, among others, and I'm not going to go into it here, although you're bound to ask me about it afterwards if you want. Now, these situations are predictable and sometimes planned, even if they surprise the spectator. They occur in every performance with the same variations that we expect from one to another. What I'm really interested in are the unplanned events, the ones that draw attention to both actors and spectators as human beings. These are the kinds that are really considered irrelevant to the study of Shakespeare, and yet they tend to be what people remember about a performance. And I'm going on the assumption that anything that's memorable is worth investigating. Here's an example. Near the end of a production of Twelfth Night in Leicester, where I used to be, an elderly actor who was playing the priest got to his one and only speech, the one in which he tells everybody that Olivia has married Cesario. Everyone on stage looked encouragingly at him as he dried halfway through this, but there was no way anyone could take over his lines. They could hardly have said, "I have a sudden intuition that perhaps you had married this couple." He made no attempt to ad-lib. He looked totally miserable. The prompter called out his lines. He finally said them after what seemed like forever, and the thing started up again. This is a very common event, of course, but I remember that I was absolutely furious when a colleague of mine who reviewed the production spent nearly all his time on this bit, ignoring almost everything about the production apart from that, and it was a good production. It seemed to me at the time that he was just demonstrating what I might call the dark side of the audience, its enjoyment of other people's humiliation. But since then, I've wondered whether it was just that we'd all been so completely traumatized by the experience that we couldn't remember anything else. There used to be a convention that reviewers ignored things like that, especially if they happened on the first night. Henry Irving apparently was notorious for getting so nervous that he said lines backwards and so on. And Bernard Shaw, as a young reviewer, was blamed for actually mentioning this kind of thing. The point seemed to be that this didn't count as part of the performance. Now, of course, lapses of memory are the most striking thing about acting, and the one thing that everybody thinks about when they ask actors the eternal question, how do you remember all those lines? Everybody who saw the National Theatre Hamlet in 1989 remembers the moment when Michael Bryant, who was playing Polonius, said, "What was I about to say?" And even those who thought they knew the play felt a chill at this moment. The person next to me, in fact, surprised everyone, including himself, as he blurted out, "Oh, fuck." Now, I don't think this was simply a tribute to Bryant's acting. It was also because it really seemed possible that this beloved and not very young actor might really have been cracking up in public. In fact, of course, the line is in the text, and the moment was completely intentional. It was one of those rare cases where intention looked like contingency. The spectacle of an elderly man rambling on and losing track of his thoughts used to be considered funny. It's become tragic in many modern productions, even when the actor doesn't fool us, as Michael Bryant did, because, of course, we now have the terrible word Alzheimer's at the back of our minds. And I think that some such possibility could have been built into the text. It's a play that's full of self-conscious references to the theater and to the importance of remembering. But I've written elsewhere quite a lot about memory. One reason I've always been so attracted to the contingent aspect of performance is that my own first experiences of Shakespeare were themselves contingent. Nowadays, I would imagine that most children have some experiences of Shakespeare in common at the beginning. There are the animated tales, and then there are the best-known productions on film or video or iPlayer with great actors and lavish visual effects. But I spent my childhood as an American Army brat and in places where there was no professional theater. So I saw my first Shakespeare play in Tokyo. It was given actually by an American high school. I was 11, and before we went, I looked at the first few lines. I don't think I'd ever seen blank verse before, and a line like, "If music be the food of love, play on," meant nothing to me, especially because there was no stage direction indicating that something was playing anyway. A few hours later, an actor walked on the stage and said, "If music be the food of love, play on." And I understood him perfectly. Of course, it did help that there was music before it started. Now, this was my version of what Puritans in Shakespeare's time would call their conversion moment. And a lot of Shakespeareans talk about something of this sort happening to them. The one other thing I remember from that evening was the end, when Sir Andrew comes on complaining that Cesario off stage has just beaten him up, and then he sees Cesario again, because of course it's now Viola. And as the actor said, "Odds lifelings, here he is!" He jumped into Sir Toby's arms, and everybody laughed their heads off. I'm sure I thought this was part of the play. I used to remind myself of this moment in later years when I was tempted to be rather snooty toward people who could remember nothing about a production except some joke like that or some moment that was visual rather than verbal. The important thing, after all, was the lines, not what people were doing. And yet, when I say that this production gave me a passionate desire to see as many plays as possible, that's exactly what I mean. I wanted to have something visual to add to the words. I first read some of the plays in paperback collections, 4 great tragedies, 4 great comedies, which had very nice drawings of the major characters. And then when I was 13, I got the Christmas present I'd asked for. Sorry, this sounds so swotty, but anyway, a complete Shakespeare, an enormous book with illustrations by Rockwell Kent. I pored over all these pictures because for the next 3 years, this was as close as I could get to seeing any of Shakespeare's characters. By now, we were living in Arkansas, and nobody was doing productions of the plays. Fortunately, while we were there, the Gielgud Mason Brando film of Julius Caesar came out, and this was when I finally added sound to my knowledge of the plays. I got a record of highlights from the film, and it made such an impression on me that I still find myself hearing lines from that play in the voices of those actors. I wonder if this would have happened if I'd been able to buy a video. I would imagine that most people now get a video of any play they're really interested in, and they have a very strong visual impression, but perhaps not so much of an oral impression of it. I looked at the production again, in fact, a few years ago, and found that I was now noticing all the visual patterns and thinking about their relationship to the lines, much more than I was listening to the way the actors spoke. But I think it was before this, actually, that the really amazing thing happened. I'd been reading the play, as I think most people read plays at the beginning. Character's name, speech, character's name, speech. Just words on the page. And then one day, I was reading the short passage where Brutus and Cassius say farewell to each other before the Battle of Philippi, and I could hear them say it. Forever and forever, farewell, Cassius. If we do meet again, why, we shall smile. If not, why then this parting was well made. And it was like the moment when, if you've studied a foreign language, you suddenly hear someone say something in it and you understand it immediately instead of translating it to yourself. This is partly, of course, because it was a speech of which I understood every single word. It's like a lot of the most famous lines in Shakespeare, which tend to be those in which there are very few difficult words, often monosyllables, and often repetition. And Cassius, in fact, goes on to say almost exactly the same thing in his reply to Brutus. But it gave me confidence that I would someday be able to understand everything. And I found from then on that when I read plays, I could hear them. I could sometimes even hear the pauses. If I couldn't hear anyone else say the lines, I realized I could also say them myself. And that's what I tended to do from then on to anyone who would listen. Well, I was lucky in that we moved from Arkansas to Paris, and I mean the one in France, not the one in another part of Arkansas. And I was able to see Shakespeare on the stage at last. Some of the productions were in French, and before I learned enough French to understand what the characters were saying, I was hearing one thing and remembering another. Which, of course, is what still happens if I go to foreign language productions. I was also discovering something about France in the 1950s, which was that it was still quite neoclassical. I saw Julius Caesar, or rather Jules César, in a production where as each body hit the stage, the audience laughed. Now, this might just have been a not very good production, but it was my first example of how audience reaction can clash with the response you think you're going to get from the play. Not long after that, though, the Peter Brook Titus Andronicus came to Paris, and Olivier's performance still sticks in my mind as the most powerful thing I've ever seen in the theater, probably, of course, because I was young and hadn't seen that much anyway. At the point where Titus cut his hand off on the stage and the axe hit the block, the entire audience shook. At least I think they did. I certainly did. And at the interval, I looked around and everybody was lying back exhausted in their seats. So I think they were all as emotionally drained as I was. In Paris, I also had access to a better library where I discovered Shakespeare Criticism, which was a joy to read because in those days it was mostly about the characters in the plays, and it helped me see and hear them. In fact, I now realize that all these critics were really directing their own personal productions, telling me who I was meant to like and dislike and how the lines should sound. They knew, apparently, whether Lady Macbeth did or did not know what Macbeth meant when he hinted that Banquo wouldn't be a problem much longer. But then I happened to read a book called Shakespeare and the Actors by Arthur Colby Sprague. It was a compilation of the way in which different actors up to 1900 had performed the plays, according to the information that he'd been able to get from stage directions in the prompt books and comments of reviewers and other spectators. And he simply told you that some actresses had made it clear that Lady Macbeth understood exactly what Macbeth had in mind and was horrified. Others were pleased, and some didn't understand it at all. And that was where I first realized, to my amazement, that the play could in fact be a completely different thing, depending on what the actor chose to do. Sprague occasionally would indicate which interpretation he thought was more likely, but he wasn't really concerned with theorizing what the actors did. As it turned out, he taught at Bryn Mawr College, which, as you know, is where I studied, and he had a great effect on me. After I'd come to do graduate work in England, we occasionally met, and he would introduce me to many theaters that I might not have known otherwise, particularly those that were experimenting with historical practices. And perhaps the best thing he did was to introduce me to Stanley. Now, by now, you must be afraid that I'm going to imitate Prospero at the end of The Tempest, where he tells everybody that he's going to spend the rest of the evening telling the story of his life. And I always suspect that their hearts sink at this moment, and that Alonso's, "Oh, I long to hear the story of your life," is just a lie. My particular story really adds up to the fact that I didn't come to Shakespeare as a set of words on the page, but as a series of quite disjunct theater experiences. including some that I knew I should probably ignore but couldn't. And it probably explains why I'm also very bad at theorizing Shakespeare, because almost anything I want to say about a Shakespeare play can be canceled out, as far as I'm concerned, by what happens in the theater. I am not trying to argue, though, that this is the only test of an interpretation, or get into the stage versus page argument. Bert States writes in Great Reckonings in Little Rooms, a book called On the Phenomenology of Theater, that there are as many things about Hamlet one cannot possibly appreciate in a performance as there are things in a performance that elude the most sensitive reading. I agree with that. You can, as Harry Berger says, create an ideal performance in your head, which is the composite of your imagination and every performance you ever saw or might see, though it could never be put on the stage. Now that's the opposite of a Platonic ideal of Shakespeare, which would be minus actors, minus stage sets, minus any theatrical interpretation at all. As philosophers have pointed out, with regard to the Platonic ideal, if you try to imagine a table that has no height, length, color, or material, you don't get an ideal table, you get no table at all. And I feel that about Shakespeare, too. Not surprisingly, there aren't many critics who have much to say about the contingent aspects of Shakespeare production, but the Bert States book that I just mentioned recognizes its importance when he says that by contrast with our experience with film, in the theater, our sympathetic involvement with the characters is attended by a secondary and largely subliminal line of empathy, born of the possibility that the illusion may at any time be shattered by a mistake or an accident. I think this fits in with the kind of excitement one feels in the theater, and I think it is in part a sort of willing of the actors to succeed, which means a sort of identification with them. There's been some recent scientific corroboration of this view. When I read Bruce McConaughey's fascinating book called Engaging the Audience, I discovered that my experience at the Peter Brook Titus Andronicus was almost a textbook example of the action of what are called mirror neurons. As he puts it, in conventional mimetic theory, playwrights and actors do the imitating. Cognitive scientists and philosophers, in contrast, have strong evidence that it is audiences who mirror the actions of those they watch on stage. Cognitive imitation is a crucial part of spectating. The one thing missing from these accounts is an explanation of why this experience is pleasurable. This is something that has concerned the relatively few writers who have analyzed audience behavior. Bridget Escolm's recent book on emotional excess on the Shakespearean stage, for instance, notes that the modern critical tendency to focus on the disturbing aspects of early modern drama seems to assume that audiences went to the theater because they wanted to be disturbed. Surely there must have been something in this that gave them pleasure. And I would argue that all imitation of emotion is pleasurable, except that I just saw A Girl as a Half-Formed Thing, and if any of you have seen that, over an hour of imitating one horrible sensation after another turned out to be horrible. But very moving. I mean, it's a tremendous performance, but you really have to be geared to it. But pleasure is what Gary Taylor investigates in his pioneering study, Moment by Moment in Shakespeare. Its other title, actually, To Analyze Delight, gives you a better idea of its subject. One of the things he did was to attend a production, Terry Hans's Henry V for the RSC, which opened in 1975. He attended it 11 times, watching the reactions of spectators and questioning them to see whether they'd understood what the actors had been trying to convey, or at least what they said they'd intended, because by then the book about the production by Sally Bowman had come out. And he found that the spectators often missed a great deal, but that this hadn't affected their pleasure in the performance. He offers a whole anthology of contingent circumstances. Not every seat in the house, for instance, gave a full view of some highly significant stage business. A lot of people didn't realize that when Henry ordered the prisoners to be killed, two people that we already knew, the Constable of France and Monsieur Le Fere, were in fact killed before our eyes, because you couldn't, in fact, always see this. If the archbishop forgot part of his long speech about the Salic law, then his line, "so that, as clear as is the summer sun," which usually gets a laugh, didn't get one. Gary Taylor's conclusion is that the production's success depended on what it communicated, not what it intended. On a more mundane level, which eventually turns out not to be so mundane, there's the work of Stephen Booth. He's probably best known to you, if you've read much criticism, as a very subtle critic of language, a rather playful one. But he has also analyzed things that gave pleasure to audiences, by which he, like Gary Taylor, really means non-academic audiences. He comments on how pleased they are to know the real-life relationships between actors in the play, how much they enjoy seeing them when they go off stage but are still visible in the wings. Whether they do or don't stay in character, it doesn't really matter. And his conclusion is that convincing and unconvincing illusion are equally pleasing in the same way, and in fact, equatable. Well, why? Because the essence of theater is not success in passing illusion off as reality, but in enabling an audience to cope with two realities at once. And as long as the balance between the two is maintained, any element in any dimension that reasserts such doubleness is likely to be to the good. Now, that point about balance is important. When an actor is clearly out of his part, like in the example I gave at the beginning, the balance isn't maintained. But an actor can be both in and out, even when forgetting lines. If you go to the Renaissance season at the Blackfriars in Stanton, Virginia, which I'm going to be doing in a few weeks, you can see actors performing in plays that are notoriously under-rehearsed, and they'll explain at the beginning that they will occasionally have to say "Prithee," at which point the prompter will kick in. It doesn't happen all that much, even in the first performances, but the effect of this device is to make forgetting lines a perfectly normal part of acting, part of the sort of spontaneous, rough style of that theater. Prithee isn't exactly an ad lib, it's sort of scripted, but it has something of the same effect as one. If it's done well, it manages to be both inside and outside the world of the play. A really good ad lib would be unrecognizable to anyone in the audience except Stanley Wells and me. But most ad libs in Renaissance plays stand out from the rest of the language and are immediately recognizable. You can hear some of the best ones nowadays in the Red Not Dead performances in the Wanamaker and the other Globe Education venues. In the last one I went to, an actor who had thrown away his script in order to fight a duel was trying to find his place again in order to die because he had a dying speech. The other actor helpfully informed him that it was page 30, the bottom thereof. And as at Stanton, the audiences look forward to things going wrong in productions like this because it's so enjoyable to see how the actors deal with them. Of course, if things went wrong all the time, it wouldn't be particularly enjoyable. If you like, you can say that our mirror neurons are enjoying the triumph over adversity and somehow identifying with it. There are lots of collections of theater anecdotes, and most of them are in fact about ad libs. I was delighted to find some of them analyzed in Paul Menser's recent book, Anecdotal Shakespeare. There's one that he's found in several versions, but apparently it was first told about John Philip Kemble in the early 19th century. You remember that Hamlet keeps telling Guildenstern, play on a recorder, and Guildenstern keeps protesting that he doesn't know how. So in these stories, Guildenstern, of course, decides to play the recorder. In one version, he plays it really well. In another one, he plays it badly. But the result either way is, of course, to leave the star performer with egg on his face. And I can't help feeling that this story is really about how a minor part actor rebels against the way in which the actor playing Hamlet, and in fact the whole play, is perpetually humiliating him. Now, Menser thinks one can see this kind of story as a desperate attempt to insert a wedge of unpredictability into the remorseless logic of a literally prescriptive existence. In fact, the desire for unpredictability in the theater is a fairly recent development. Most theatrical anecdotes date from the 19th century, when an actor had to fit his role into the production of another company, quite often, like a component of a Model T Ford, with only the most minimal rehearsal. When a star actor went on tour, the local companies had to work up the plays that he or she had chosen, and perhaps they had one rehearsal to make sure they knew the right business. Since it was a relatively limited number of plays being given in pretty much the same way every time, some of the audience also knew the play as well as the actors. There are actually stories of the so-called king of the gallery. That was a regular theatergoer in the top gallery with a particularly loud voice who prompted the leading actor, who then bowed to him in acknowledgement. Now, audiences got annoyed in this kind of theater if any actor made a change to the well-known traditional business, especially if the business was comic. The old jokes were the best jokes. And this fondness for tradition lasted longer than you might think. Now, for example, we expect to see different costumes and sets for each production, but Audrey Williamson's History of the Old Vic comments on a Richard III in 1936 and the afterlife of Richard's striking gown of bottle green velvet with a leopard skin collar. This adorned many a happy student and small part player in succeeding Old Vic productions, and was always recognized with joy and affection by the audience. This kind of joy is now available only to members of amateur dramatic societies. Some of the most elaborate theatrical anecdotes depend on this sense that everyone knows what is supposed to happen at a given moment in the play. John Coleman's book, 50 Years of an Actor's Life, which was published in 1904, is full of stories that are really too good to be true, but it's significant that he considered them believable, and maybe even believed them himself. I can't resist quoting one of them, though it's quite elaborate. It's about Charles Keene, son of the great Edmund Keene, acting with a company in the provinces. Coleman had acted with this man, but the story isn't based on personal experience. It really couldn't be. It describes a performance, and of course it's Macbeth, in which Keene was on the stage as Macbeth, calling for Seaton. And the actor of that part, who had probably had to get it up especially for the star actor, was off in the green room telling jokes with his friends. Now, actors in this period were fined for anything which brought the production to what was called a dead stick. That is, a moment at which it was obvious that somebody had either missed a cue to speak or a cue to enter. So here's what Coleman writes. There was a dead stick, and Keene was furious. He prowled up and down the stage like a tiger, growling, "Where's the brute? Send him on, that I may kill him!" After a prolonged delay, Mr. O. Seaton appeared. "What's your grace's will?" he inquired in great trepidation. "Saw you the weird sisters?" fiercely inquired Keene, to which Seaton ought to reply, "No, my lord." But with a desire to make matters agreeable to the irate tragedian, he replied, "Yes, my lord." Quite taken off his balance, Keene gasped, "The devil you did! Where are they, then?" Utterly unmanned, the wretched Seaton replied, "I'll show your majesty if you'll deign to step round the corner." Now, this may sound like an example of the bad luck that supposedly attaches to performances of Macbeth, but one of Paul Mentzer's most interesting discoveries is that the superstition about quoting Macbeth in the theater and the larger superstition about it being a bad luck play dates only from the 20th century. He's found a number of accounts of misfortunes occurring in earlier productions, but not with the added comment that this was just one more proof of the bad luck about the play. And his theory is that the superstition was invented unintentionally to provide the frisson that the play unfortunately fails to provide in the theater in nearly all performances. Perhaps it even provides an excuse for the well-known fact that so many distinguished actors have been unsuccessful in the role. But you can also see Coleman's story as another example of the perhaps unconscious desire for revenge on the part of the minor actor. He's supposedly trying to be helpful, like the actor who plays the recorder, but of course he makes nonsense of the scene, and the audience is bound to know it. So it's worth thinking more about how a performance is affected by the presence of a star actor. Theatrical tradition indicates that his first appearance was often special, especially in popular drama. And you can think of the delayed entrances, for example, in Kathakali drama, if any of you have seen that, where he's behind a blanket jumping up and down, but they finally drop the blanket so you can see him. Or indeed the Tudor Vice, who, in the case of the play Mankind, you have to pay extra to see, apparently. At the Kabukiza in Tokyo, sorry about all this name dropping, you can not only hear a simultaneous translation of the play into English, the translator also tells you the places at which the actors expect applause. And connoisseurs at the kabuki sit in a special part of the theater, and they lead the applause at key moments, which are very much like those in melodrama, where actors go into some kind of pose or tableau. Now, it was still pretty much like the 19th century in France in the 1950s. In 1957, I saw a visiting production of Henry VIII with a stunning cast. John Gielgud as Wolsey, Harry Andrews as the King, and Edith Evans as Queen Catherine. The French part of the audience applauded Edith Evans, and for some reason only her, every time she came on, or went out, or said more than 5 lines of verse. We might almost have been back in the days of Charles Keene, except that the Anglophone spectators in this crowd started trying to shut them up, so there was a little war going on for a while in the theater. I wondered whether Shakespeare wanted to ensure Richard Burbage a big reception. How far back does this go? Some of the plays do seem designed to really build up his entrance. The king is coming. A drum, Macbeth doth come. And of course, in Antony and Cleopatra, look where they come, followed by behold and see. It's about as much of an entrance as you could get. Of course, one can't be sure that in other plays where there isn't something like that, there wasn't simply a convention of the actors all going about the stage at the beginning, so that you got to see the whole cast and perhaps could applaud as you wished. Shakespeare productions in the 19th century, however, felt they had to make up for Shakespeare's failure to guarantee a big reception to the leading actor. So in Hamlet, for example, the hero often came in a little after the others in the second scene, so that he wouldn't be lost in the crowd and could get a big round of applause. Applause was almost literally the breath of life for an actor. Menser has found a story about Edmund Kean acting in Kilkenny. Apparently his performance at the beginning was so tame that audiences didn't believe it really was him. And the stage manager finally came on and told them the problem was their failure to applaud. So they followed his advice, and then they got a real Edmund Kean-type performance, which, as you know, was said to be like reading Shakespeare by flashes of lightning. He probably did need the rest that the applause gave him, because those were huge theaters and it was hard on the voice to speak in them. But he also obviously needed the sense that his audience was with him. Sarah Siddons, who was used to having her performance interrupted by applause, went on tour to Edinburgh. These stories always seem to be about places away from London, the sticks. And she found that audiences were so awed by her that they listened to her in rapt silence. So she let it be known indirectly that she preferred the applause because it allowed her to recover from her exertions. Now, except for the entrance welcome, applause does usually come at a point when an actor, like an opera singer really, has just done something that has used up a lot of breath. And some of Shakespeare's most theatrical plays show this awareness of the actor's physical difficulty with having enough breath for the lines. Mowbray in Richard II feels that not being able to speak, because he's banished from the one country where he knows the language, is like not being able to breathe. Later in the play, York uses the dying Gaunt's difficulty in breathing as a metaphor for his attempts to lecture Richard, which are a waste of breath. The Henry IV plays begin with a very odd reference to peace, gasping for breath, in a speech which, like most of Henry IV's speeches, and those of Hotspur and Falstaff, is extremely long. These 3 actors are, in fact, in a competition for airspace. In Part 2, we hear of Hotspur speaking thick in Part 1, which may be a retrospective comment on his performance, and he's said to have been outbreathed by Hal, which seems to mean both that Hal won the combat because he had more energy, literally more breath, but also perhaps that he got the last word literally by taking it out of Hotspur's mouth. And of course, there's constant emphasis on Falstaff's breathlessness. The 18th century editor of an acting edition, who had also played Falstaff as it happened, wrote that he would have recommended cutting much of the first scene between Hotspur and his wife, which he thought was trivial. Did not Sir John want some breathing time? This was, as far as he was concerned, a welcome gap between two scenes in which the actor had to, again, come panting on. And even in modern productions, he probably needs breathing time because a fat suit is heavy and uncomfortable to wear. So it's lucky that modern audiences still quite often do applaud Falstaff's big speeches. But nowadays, we're happy with spontaneous applause, but productions go out of their way to avoid the kind that's given purely for the actor and not for the character. And fear of the possible disruption is one reason why I think I can call the star actor's presence part of the contingent element. In recent years, as you know, there's been a tendency for actors who've been famous on the big or the small screen to return to the theater, and this guarantees sellout performances. I have a theory about the Lindsay Turner production of Hamlet with Benedict Cumberbatch, which most of you must have seen either in the theater or on the screen. This is that the rather startling adaptations made to the text were caused by the need to counteract the star effect. For instance, Hamlet was discovered on stage from the start so that there wouldn't be any question of whether to applaud him when he came on. There might have been a similar motive behind that controversial moving of To Be or Not to Be to the beginning of the play initially. It was moved back after the reviewers protested, but there may have been a desire not just to get it over with, but to avoid having the audience waiting for it. Here's that bit we know is famous that actors have a lot of trouble with. Let's see how he does it. Stephen Booth has argued that the difference between stars and actors is that an actor is unrecognizable when he moves to a different role, whereas the star's personality in other roles carry over from one part to another. In this Hamlet, the most striking redistributions of lines, and there were lots of them, had to do with Horatio. Although he was a bit of a bumbler, he was also much more helpful to Hamlet than usual. In the play as written, he's really just a sounding board. He and Hamlet have a relationship from the very beginning. He's the one who finds the evidence of Claudius's personality cult, a commemorative plate that he brings in showing his picture in little. And since he's not present in Ophelia's mad scenes, he's not guilty of suppressing important information that Hamlet needs to know in the graveyard scene. But in lines that should be Hamlet's, he points out the significance of the maimed rites for the corpse that turns out to be Ophelia's. Most important, he usurps Gertrude's lost lines in order to tell Hamlet that the drink is poisoned. The effect, as you've probably gathered by now, was to make him what we really want him to be, Dr. Watson. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that contingency necessarily produces a wonderful theatrical experience. Sometimes it destroys any possibility of one, especially when some of the audience would rather be somewhere else. When I read about the Georgian theater in the days of enormous auditoriums and low prices in the top gallery, I feel that the people who say they want a genuinely popular audience should be careful what they wish for. Some of the members of that audience came in order to engage in, frankly, mob behavior and take advantage of the relative anonymity of the crowd. They would boo or hiss an actor or a play on very trivial grounds. They would insist that a patriotic song be sung because of some event in the news, or start a riot because of some decision by the management. And these are things that most of us would really rather not see in the theater, although there are other places where they can still be found. Audiences in the early days of the reconstructed globe sometimes thought this is what they were expected to do. And it's still true, as the actors say there, that you can't predict the behavior of the groundlings. They can find laughs where you would never expect them. If there's a largely teenage audience, you're likely to get people making loud kissing noises during a love scene. But actors can do even more damage by their reactions. I was once at a production at the Other Place in Stratford where an actor bawled the audience out for talking. Then he went off stage and started the play again. But we were all so horrified and shaken that we couldn't concentrate for some time. This would have been different, I suppose, when Tarleton and Kemp harangued the audience, but they would have been in the same verbal register as the play they were in, whereas this just took us completely out of it. On the other hand, I was at the Globe's Antony and Cleopatra when an angry groundling on the far side of the pit declared loudly that she was fed up with not being able to see or hear because the actors weren't playing to her side of the stage. "It's all right," she finished up. "I'm leaving now," and she did. Well, the actors continued, and only a few lines later we got, "We have cause to be glad that matters are so well digested." And everyone applauded, even though some of us groundlings agreed with her that the actors should be playing more to the sides of the theater and not just the center. And in fact, I think they were doing that last summer. We still felt a sort of delight that the words of the play had done the work for the actors. It's been very interesting to watch actors and audiences grow into the globe space and learn how to balance the needs of different kinds of spectators. One thing they often do is to create as many moments as possible to let the audience express itself without wrecking the play, with the trade-off that they'll then be quiet at the moments that need quiet. Of course, you don't have to be at the Globe to see this sort of thing. Many productions of Richard III, for instance, including the one I just saw at the Odeon in Paris, will get the audience to applaud Richard in the moments when he rises to power. And they play, of course, with the audience's awareness that this isn't really something to be happy about. It's also possible to create dialogue between the actor and the audience. Long ago, Robert Stevens, playing Benedict at the National, managed to do this with the famous soliloquy after the eavesdropping scene. He quoted the overheard conversation with its comment that Beatrice was wise but for loving me, and added ruefully, "By my troth, it is no addition to her wit." This got a laugh, which then allowed him to glare at the audience for laughing and reply, "Nor no great argument of her folly." Presumably, he played it differently at performances where there was no laugh on that line. A couple of actors have noted the possibility that Hamlet's question, "Am I a coward?" in a soliloquy could get an answer from the audience, probably yes. That's the sort of thing that could now, I think, be built into the part, though that depends very much on the style of production. When Richard of Gloucester, after wooing Lady Anne, asks, "Was ever woman in this humor wooed?" he must long for somebody to say no, because then he can top it with, "Was ever woman in this humor won?" On the other hand, there are characters who can't and shouldn't try for rapport with the audience. In Antony and Cleopatra, Cleopatra can flirt with the audience, but Octavius probably shouldn't even notice their existence. If the actors can ride the wave, even the most horrendous interruptions can become part of the experience instead of destroying it. I gather that drama schools now teach actors how to cope with the ringing of mobile phones, because it's bound to happen. And I'm sure that Globe actors are given advice about dealing with helicopters. My most extraordinary experience at that theater happened 2 summers ago. It was at the same production of Antony and Cleopatra that I just mentioned, but not the same performance. In fact, it was a preview, and since the theater doesn't have understudies, another actor, John Light, was reading the part of Antony in place of Clive Wood, who had flu. I'm not sure whether John Light had even had a chance to rehearse. At one point, he clearly had no idea where Cleopatra was, and she had to call out from the yard, "I'm here!" This was Eve Best, who, of course, is in her element in this kind of situation. I was, for once, in a seat in the gallery rather than the yard, and this was lucky, because about a third of the way into the play, there was an absolutely violent thunderstorm. The play always goes on at the Globe, and the galleries and the stage are largely under cover, but I wasn't surprised to see the yard get pretty empty. What did surprise me was that a few minutes later it started to fill up again. The groundlings had gone indoors to the Globe shop, bought those rain capes that were £5 each, and come back wearing them. The noble Romans played their scenes, happily under cover. Antony said farewell to Octavius and Octavia and looked out across the yard to where the soothsayer was approaching, not under cover. This poor man had to walk all the way across the yard to the stage, and by the time he got there, he was dripping from head to foot. The advantage of knowing a play really well is that you get 2 kinds of pleasure. Antony said his line, "Now, Sirrah, you do wish yourself in Egypt?" And the audience simply exploded. It got better. The messenger replied, "Would I had never come from thence." And then there was a deafening clap of thunder, and this went on for some time, frequently drowning out the actors, who got as wet as we did because it was a production that used the yard a good deal. At the interval, by which time the storm had pretty much stopped, everyone was saying, "Well, we'll certainly remember this performance." The second half also had some memorable moments, though, not due to the storm, as when the dying Antony was carried in on a litter holding his script up, rather like someone reading a magazine in bed. There was a lot of laughter at that, but it was sympathetic laughter. Not only had the poor man messed up his suicide, which of course is part of the play, but he was having to play his death scene in absolutely ludicrous circumstances. The play, I think, had absorbed the external world into itself instead of being defeated by it. I should add that I did make a point of going to this production again on a non-rainy day, this time as a groundling, and that Clive Wood, when I finally got to see him, was probably the best Antony in my experience. In fact, I saw it a third time in the Wanamaker when they did one of the indoor productions, and I enjoyed not having the noise of helicopters and the unpredictable groundling behavior. So these were essentially three completely different versions of the play, and I liked all of them in different ways. This in itself is remarkable because Antony and Cleopatra is one of the most difficult of Shakespeare's plays to bring off. And Stephen Booth has called Antony a kamikaze role, that is, one in which the actor is almost certainly going to fail and get terrible reviews. But I remember the whole experience of that early, weather-beaten, totally contingent performance as one in which the audience and actors were united in absolute ecstasy. Now, was this specific to Shakespeare? If it had been any other dramatist, would we simply have gone home and considered the whole experience literally a washout? Did we have a basic faith in the play and the actors that kept us turning everything into gold? A cynic might say that we were congratulating ourselves on just being there. The same thing is often said about those marathons where you see 3 history plays in one day and eat sandwiches on the stairs. I've seen it suggested, in fact, that theater going itself now is a source of self-congratulation for those who can afford to do it and don't have to confine themselves to television and film, because they can make other people feel deprived, by saying, you had to be there, which certainly in this case was true. But I'm not even sure this would have worked for every Shakespeare play. Antony and Cleopatra is a play about turning defeat into victory. The 2 central characters are always performing in public, and not very much does embarrass them. Cleopatra's essential theatricality comes out in some curiously irrelevant but fascinating lines. I saw her once hop 40 paces through the public street, and having lost her breath, she stopped and panted, that she did make defect perfection, and breathless pour breath forth. I actually like the other reading, and breathless power breathe forth, rather better, but and I think she spoke and panted rather than stopped and panted. Anyway, would breathlessness be a defect in anyone but an actor? You don't really notice this kind of thing in real people. Am I just imagining that these lines incorporate the contingent into the play in the way that I've already described us doing as spectators? Breathlessness is a virtue in Shakespearean drama. It goes with excitement, fight scenes, passionate speeches, death scenes. It pleases me that one of the last great speeches Shakespeare wrote, Emilia's defense in The Two Noble Kinsmen of the possibility of friendship between young women, gets the reply, "You're out of breath." It suggests to me that even at the end of his career, Shakespeare was aware of the actor inside the character. So I return to Stephen Booth's argument and quote it again. The essence of theater is not success in passing illusion off as reality, but in enabling an audience to cope with 2 realities at once. And as long as the balance between the 2 is maintained, any element in any dimension that reasserts such doubleness is likely to be to the good. He was arriving empirically at the same idea that is put more abstractly by cognitive scientists. McConaughey, for instance, describes something called conceptual blending, which is the process by which audiences gradually blend the actor and the character together into one image, one concept of identity, to enable their affective immersion in the performance. What this adds to Booth is the fact that spectators can, to some extent, control the way they do this blending. And my own view is that they control in order to maximize the pleasure they get out of it. Now, audience members who deliberately notice all the negative things about a performance, I think, are either those who aren't aware of the kind of pleasure they could get by doing the opposite, or they simply get more pleasure from feeling superior to the performance than they can do from the thing itself. And we're all in this situation sometimes. I'm not saying you have to like everything you see in the theater. Obviously, the better you know a play and the more often you've seen it, the more complex the blending process is likely to be. I know that I sometimes deliberately ignore things that might spoil my pleasure and dwell on those that could enhance it. For instance, I realized that part of my pleasure in the effect of Antony's line in that production came from the fact that I already knew what he was going to say and was looking forward to it, and at the same time was letting myself be surprised by the reaction. One of the best examples of the way in which this doubleness can inform and enrich a production was the Red Not Dead performance of Every Man in His Humor in the Wanamaker a couple of years ago. Some of the things that went into my response to it include reading that Tony Church had wanted to play Old Nowell in the Swan production because he thought that, wrongly as it turned out, that it would be the first production in that new theater. Tony Church didn't say, but I guessed that he also knew the tradition, for which there's no real proof, that Shakespeare himself had played that part. In the Wanamaker production, however, there was an added source of delight because the actor who played Old Nowell was Stanley Wells, first seen with a copy of the Oxford Shakespeare on his lap. This was funnier than the original performance can ever have been because back then, nobody knew that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. And now, of course, a lot of people think that Shakespeare was Stanley Wells. That's not just doubleness, but tripleness, and I can't go beyond that, so I'd better stop. Thank you, Stanley, and thanks to everybody.
That was a production in which at one time I came out of the green room and found nobody on the stage. And, oh, there's nobody here. I went back.
Yes, another of those moments that everybody was so delighted with.
Can I ask you about Red Velvet? Have you seen Red Velvet?
Yes. Well, the trouble with Red Velvet is that I did a lot of work on Ira Aldridge at one point, and he simply wasn't a naturalistic actor before his time. He was, if anything, rather old-fashioned. I was bothered by the inaccuracies of it. I think as a play, if you don't know anything about Ira Aldridge, it's very enjoyable. But I was still rather disappointed that they didn't say more about his career outside England. I mean, that was a very interesting part of his life when he was performing. I think when he first went abroad, he tried to take a company with him, but then he found it worked better to act in English in a company that was speaking its own language. And he got really good at this, even in Russia, for example. He did very heavily cut texts, I think, because these poor actors had to learn all this, presumably for the first time. And he found a way of somehow indicating when they were supposed to speak by some sort of gesture, or maybe he learned a few words of the language. But he played in a lot of different countries. I mean, he was acting in Sweden and Poland and so on. And he apparently also learned to sing songs in these languages. I just thought all this was fascinating, and none of it got into the performance. And I was also fascinated by the fact that he used to play parts that were essentially comic black men, which I don't think was, unless I haven't seen the current version of the play. I saw it a year ago or 2 years ago, so it may have been changed since then. But I was fascinated by the fact that not only did he, I think the production does indicate that he played King Lear in white makeup, but what it doesn't indicate really is something that I've always found puzzling, just how did he play some of the comic black characters that he certainly did play.
Yeah, they didn't do that at all, but there was imitation of what they thought was early 19th century acting. Grossly exaggerated in character, I thought.
Yeah.
Leicester, I thought, was magnificent when he was playing Othello, the real Othello.
Yeah.
Really wonderful.
Yeah.
So splendid. But I just wondered what you thought, whether you would feel too, as I did, that the pseudo-19th, Charles Keane's in it.
Yes.
I thought it was just parodied.
It was, yes. Well, this always happens when anybody attempts to recreate earlier acting. It's the same in Nell Gwyn, which some of you may have seen. I mean, that attempts to show you some restoration acting, and people just go into attitudes. And, of course, anything like that is bound to look funny. I mean, our acting would look funny, too, to somebody, seeing it from a different angle, or even possibly in a country with a different theatrical tradition. That's the trouble. If you make it look as it would have looked to audiences in its own time, then it won't look any different from the kind of acting we're used to. Or at least I think it's very difficult to get acting in inverted commas.
Yeah. It's why it's better to read about acting than to see films of those actors, too.
On the whole, yes, alas.
The floor is open to questions, so...
Hi. Thanks very much, Lois. That's wonderful. I'm sure we've talked about this in the past, but I wonder whether you'd like to say something about like audience reaction 400 years ago in the Globe. And I just find it hard to believe that The Merchant of Venice would take place with the casket scene, the characters coming on and saying, which casket, which shall I choose, and not getting any kind of advice from the wits in the audience. And there must be, and that's the most obvious, but there must be other moments in Shakespeare plays that 400 years ago you think, well, the rowdy groundlings in the Globe would have reacted to.
Yes, I don't think, however, that anybody in The Merchant of Venice, any of the three choosing a casket, actually asks a direct question like that. I think doing that might possibly be a big mistake. But as far as I can recall, most of the moments where there's a question like that would not be damaged by audience response. I'm thinking of Edmund, wondering which of the sisters he should choose, both, one, or neither. That seems to be the moment where if somebody yells, well, don't take either, then they're bad news or something, that would not really matter at that point. It seems to me it's like what I was saying about Octavius. There's no way really that Octavius, maybe when he says poor Antony, he could possibly say that to the audience, but there's pretty well nothing in his part that allows for any kind of interaction with the audience. And I think on the whole, the audience waits for someone to speak to it before it speaks back.
I don't believe in the rowdy audiences in the Globe, the original Globe. I mean, there may have been an element, but a lot of what of the myth about that is created by the very early reactions of Puritan preachers. And those audiences made popular the most emotionally, intellectually demanding works that the theatre has ever offered to anybody. More demanding than the operas of Wagner, for example. Far more demanding than anything that's acted on the West End stage today. I respect those audiences. They made popular King Lear and Othello. Hamlet perhaps has a bit more of the popular elements. What do you think?
I think basically that Shakespeare couldn't have written those plays if he'd assumed that the actors are going to be barracked from beginning to end, or that there was going to be a really rowdy, difficult audience. There were different kinds of audience, and it is certainly possible that the plays were cut and shaped in different ways for those audiences. I'm very struck by the fact that after James came to the throne, partly because there were long periods of the theatre being closed for plague, the public theatre, and partly because there were so many more court performances, and particularly court performances with distinguished foreign visitors who didn't know English. I think there would have been a lot more emphasis on possibly shorter texts with a lot more singing and dancing in them. And better costumes. There seems to have been a feeling that the costumes for court performances had to be really splendid, possibly more splendid than those, in the public theatre. And this would be the equivalent, really, of, some of these sort of coterie opera performances. I think the same might have been true at the Inns of Court. And I think it is quite likely that the early years of James's reign, a lot more of Shakespeare's plays were being given in they got a lot more private performances than they did public performances, just because of the conditions, the plague particularly. But this doesn't mean that I don't think they worked in the public theatre. And what I was saying about the breathlessness theme in Henry IV, for example, I mean, those plays, obviously have tremendous popular appeal, but they are also intellectually very demanding. And you can see that people going to them more than once would certainly recognize the extraordinary kind of balance of the characters and the positions that they're taking, and the way that the play really does leave you torn between different sort of ideals. What Hotspur represents, what Hal represents, what Falstaff represents.
Humanity, the two It's a very difficult play in some ways, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It's mad, like symbolism. A lot of the language is so contorted. So
Yes.
contorted. And that was a play that was done at court,
Yes.
as far as we know, in a full text. And even when we have adapted texts, as we have with Macbeth, for example, we believe now, it's not only the hard bits that are cut out.
No. No, well, I've never really understood the language of Shakespeare's late plays. I mean, just what it is that makes him write, even allowing for problems of transmission, all sorts of things. What makes him use such difficult and convoluted language? It sometimes seems to go with a complex state of mind, but not always. Sometimes you feel it's just saying something very simple in a very complex way.
Quite often in the
Yes.
Lois, I want to go back to the two kinds of stories that you've been telling us. One of which is the versions of your own experiences, which we take to be, of course, embellished by memory and the elegance of your prose, but also based on something that you experienced. And then many of these stories, particularly the kind that Paul Menzer, I think, very interestingly is dealing with, which we all wish were true, but none of us quite believe were true. If that Guildenstern really did do that, that was his last night on stage. Yes, he was sacked from the company the following morning, and actors, by and large, did not set out to get themselves sacked, even for the sake of a good joke at their boss's expense. So we're left with the sense in which the theatre stories that we all like to tell, many of them are based on a wish that they were true, but a disbelief that they ever were true. How do we work with these two kinds of material, one of which is your own truth-telling, the other is a kind of wishing it were true of the story from elsewhere?
Well, I think Menzer's idea of why we wish these were true partly has to do with just the, to me anyway, it's the pleasure not only of something going wrong, but something being recovered in the case of successful ad-libs. And even in that case, what's so odd about all those 19th century stories is that they usually involve the actors speaking quite a lot, impromptu, because I think he quotes a couple of different versions of that story, and in each case the actor says something like, well, if your grace really insists, I will be happy to oblige you, or something. And this is, of course, extremely unlikely, even more unlikely than his playing the pipe. But there must be a sort of delight. This is what I felt most strongly, I think, about the pleasure of somehow Shakespeare's words and real words, turning out to be the same thing. And I suppose that's what happens when you get an ad lib. It suddenly becomes part of the play. There's an interesting story about Macready in a different play, Byron's Werner, in fact, where he actually, according to Coleman, improvised a sublime gag, which is a line that the actor makes up and gets inserted into the play. And what he did was really elaborate. I find this hard to believe, but Coleman says Macready told him this. He says to someone, are you a father? And then he, under his breath, says to the man, say no. So the man says, no. And then Macready says, then you cannot know a grief like mine. And then everybody applauds. And there are weird things like that. He apparently inserted another line, oh, for an hour of youth, into Bulwer Lytton's Richelieu, which again, everybody was very moved by. This is the kind of thing that Coleridge and others thought got inserted into Shakespeare by the actors, which I just can't believe, because these lines were not written down in the text of the plays, and I don't think that if, the drunken porter had made up half of his speech, that it would have got written into the text of Macbeth either. But again, it's interesting that there's this desire, I don't know, is it a desire for us to be, just slightly creative too in a Shakespeare play, be co-authors?
I have a quick question, actually. You mentioned about the line feeders, the devices people come up with of when someone dries up on stage, how do they get the line to them? And in fact, I did a 48-hour play of Twelfth Night at university where I had to play a fool, and one of the things was, oh, fool, come whisper in my ear, was the cue to go and tell the line. So I was actually really curious to see if you had an idea on what would be the best way of having a device? What would be the best device to get a line on stage maybe in the Shakespearean style or contemporary style? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, apparently there were actors once who were so into Shakespeare that they really could ad-lib in blank verse. I have heard people come out with something a bit like that. I wish I could remember exactly what he said. Someone at Stratford, I think, once I did hear say something that actually scanned and was not a Shakespeare line. Of course, he might have learned it wrong or something, in which case he thought it was a Shakespeare line.
There's a marvelous bit in Ken Branagh's autobiography beginning about how he was playing Henry V, and there was no leak for him in the leak scene, and how he went around everybody improvising lines, and he prints in this autobiography. I quote them in my recent essay on Brandon in my book about Richard, not an advertisement, where he actually calls on the stage manager, I haven't got any more fucking leaks. It's a wonderful narrative of an accident that clearly did happen.
Yeah, that's lovely, because Macready says in his journal that he was in a performance of Macbeth where the actor playing Banquo was supposed to take a ring off his finger when he says that Duncan has sent this, to Lady Macbeth, only there was no ring, and the actor tried to mime it and give it to him, and Macready says, I would not take it. I mean, nothing like killing someone else, on the stage.
Thank you for a really wonderful lecture. I was thinking through a lot of what you were saying in the lecture and also a lot of what you've said just now about Pyramus and Thisbe in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and thinking about, I wonder whether you have thoughts about the kind of simulation of contingency that goes on there. But I think also, what you were saying about the empathy for the actors that an audience feels and how we're kind of willing them to get it right. That's often my experience of Pyramus and Thisbe, that obviously they're getting it wrong. It is the play that goes wrong. And we love it, but we end up very much on their side and rooting for them. And I was thinking also about what you were saying about the kind of the blending of identity, the cognitive blending, and how there are the three layers there. It's not just the actor playing bottom, but it's the actor playing bottom playing Pyramus, and we're aware of those three different levels, but we also let them kind of interact with each other. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that whole segment of A Midsummer Night's Dream in the light of the kind of things you were talking about. Yes, the main thing I think of with that episode is actually the curious business with the prologue, and I think that's because which depends entirely on punctuation, which means, in fact, points, and that it explains that sort of the idea if you can't see the point, and you really can't see the point of that speech if you can't see the points in it. I think that I've never seen any real explanation of how that happens to be given in that way, except, well, I did see one performance where Quince was so depressed at when they thought Bottom wasn't coming back that he simply tore up the first page of his script into little pieces. And then, of course, when Bottom returned and he suddenly realized we're putting this play on, he got the whole thing, got a bit of sellotape and started putting it back together again. And you could see what had happened. But as far as the rest of it, that there is that one bit that apparently isn't a traditional bit of stage business that someone refers to, I think, that which implies that Thisbe, when she couldn't get hold of the sword because it was presumably under Pyramus, killed herself with the scabbard. And that seems to be a traditional bit of business there, and rather a nice one. We wish we had a lot more examples of things like that. Now, as far as ways of handling, crises on the stage, I think people often do just attempt to kind of fill in the words for other people. I'm pretty sure I heard someone doing this once in a French production where somebody was supposed to be insulting somebody and the other person just kept supplying him with words to insult him. I mean, it was very unbelievable, but it kept the scene going. But it's really quite difficult to make that kind of thing work. The other thing that happens in Shakespeare is the kind of people yelling out, which I think is because the audiences in that period, unlike ours, did do an awful lot of memorizing. They all did. I mean, they would have had to for confirmation, for example. And they could be much more critical of actors who didn't know the lines.
Because after all, they did know how to learn things up to a point. So I doubt that Elizabethan audiences ever said, how do you learn all those lines?
Lois, do you know when audiences started to behave better between the 19th and the 20th century? I mean, my favorite anecdote is from Great Expectations, where Mr. Wopsle is playing Hamlet, and on To Be or Not To Be, they tell him to toss up for it. And I wonder if it has something to do with Wagner's turning out the lights toward the end of the 19th century. And did that, or was it Granville Barker where people started getting...
No, I think actually the most crucial thing is the Theatres Act of 1843, because, that allowed more theatres to be built in London. I mean, up till then, there were only 2 licensed theatres, but just kept getting bigger and bigger. And so you had the anonymity of the upper gallery, very cheap seats. Once you get smaller theatres, then of course you also charge more. You have to make them work. You therefore get a more select audience. You can also do plays of a different kind. You can get actors who don't have enormous voices playing more naturalistically. I mean, I think that really is the key thing.
Well, Lois, thank you very much for your wonderful contribution to this lecture series, and would just like to extend a small token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you. Gosh.
And then we'd like to invite the rest of you to join us for a reception where we can continue the conversation. But please join me in thanking you.